Today we revisit one of our favorite southeastern gardens to discuss the birth of their brand new inspiration garden. You won't want to miss it, so stay tuned as we garden smart from Georgia.
These moments of beauty and relaxation are brought to you by Proven Winners Flowering Shrubs, where every plant is performance tested, leaving you free to just enjoy. Find our award-winning shrubs at your local garden center.
Now more than ever, our homes are our havens, where we learn, love, and live. Let garden projects, inspired or simple, bring beauty and comfort to you. Wherever you choose to plant good, we're with you.
DRAM has been providing gardeners with professional equipment for over 75 years. DRAM products feature 9 water patterns and are designed to nurture your plants with a shower of rain. DRAM for lawn and garden, available at garden centers near you.
You have to rely on your gear. The way it feels, the way it does exactly what you need it to do. The F-Pace, how Jaguar makes it SUV.
Today we return to Gibbs Gardens to discuss the commencement of their brand new inspiration garden. We followed the development of the inspiration garden for the past 2 years and are excited to finally see it all coming to fruition. While installing a new garden can be quite an undertaking, there's so much work that happens before the first spade hits the soil. Ideas become a solidified vision that begins to instruct the more tangible plans. From there, the fine-tuned detail work brings more focus and shape to the project, and we begin to get a sense of the heart and soul of the emerging garden. Gibbs Garden is comprised of 16 unique gardens that have been developed over the past 40 years. Jim Gibbs has an insatiable desire to keep creating and pushing the boundaries of what is possible with garden design. Gibbs Garden is an ever-evolving work of art, and today we explore its next chapter. Joining us today is the garden's owner, Jim Gibbs, who is a brilliant plantsman, garden designer, and longtime friend. Jim, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure spending a day with you.
Thank you, Eric. It's great to see you again.
Wonderful. Yeah. So Gibbs Garden is one of the most beautiful places on earth. You've been working on this for 35 years, right?
Correct, yes.
Wow. So how does this new garden fit into what already is here?
I started the gardens, like you said, 35 years ago, and I wanted to design plant collections so that I could actually educate and inspire future generations. We started out with the 16 gardens that were here before the Inspiration Garden, and that's the name of this garden. We have over 10 acres in this one area. So I knew that I wanted a conifer collection, dwarf ginkgos, a collection of those are in the garden, and they work well with the conifers. We have here also the dissectum lace-leaf Japanese maples, which work well, and we have a collection of 100 rare dwarf Japanese maples, and we have the Acer palmatum, which is the larger Japanese maple. We have a collection of those, over 135 new ones in this garden, and we already have over 3,000 Japanese maples of over 300 varieties that are throughout Gibbs Gardens.
Jim, I understand there were many challenges initially with the site, not the least of which was Mother Nature, but also just dealing with something as expansive, 10 acres. Talk us through the process of cleaning up after the hurricane and the challenges that came with that.
Well, after Irma came in a couple of years ago, we had to deal with all of the removal of trees. Once we did the tree removal on the space, we had to look at the spaces that we were going to be working with. We had some open areas that, of course, were then full sun. This was a wooded lot. I mean, It was just like all the surrounding trees here you see. So we came in and divided this up into spaces so that we could work with each space and develop plant collections within the spaces. So we started there and decided what collections we would use on the site, and we began to put the plan together because we had to deal with full sun or part shade or part sun. So this was a challenge to say the least, because the topography is very steep in here. So when you look at the topography and the space and working with such a huge open space, but we did fortunately have some trees that Irma didn't touch, and we were able to work off of those trees. And so the process just began, and it worked through until we got everything ready with the topography to sort of start the planting of the plants that would go into the site.
That's one thing I think is wonderful about Gibbs Garden. Every time I come visit, it's a huge garden, but with all these small, intimate spaces throughout, I can get ideas and inspiration for my own garden because around every corner, it's like its own new, independent, little small garden that's connected by these beautiful switchbacks and trails that take us through this wooded area. It's really, really nicely done. Jim, starting a new garden can feel like a daunting task, but it also, I think, is a really, really exciting part in the process because it's where we have this blank canvas and we can start to imagine what the potential of that space is and what it can be. And that planning is very, very important. I want you to talk about, as you looked at this space, what was the process behind you figuring out how you wanted this land to be used?
Well, of course, after Irma, which was the tropical storm in our area, when I came out and saw this here, I was in total shock. Just could not imagine what I could do with the space. Trees were down everywhere, and all I could think about is, what am I going to be able to do? So what I had to start thinking about was the areas that were, once we got the trees out, I had to think about sort of the areas that would be sun or part shade or part sun. And then, as in any garden, you have to think first about how are we going to be able to get the traffic flow through the garden? How can people be able to meander and really enjoy a beautiful space? So we've got to take this ugly space, which was a bunch of lemons, and make lemonade out of it. So how do I do that? So as I first do it in any garden, I try to look at the walkways. The walkways are what guide the viewer through the garden and what they're going to be able to see. So I had to first, and I know from experience, try to follow the topography always. Once you follow the topography, you will have more gentle, level walkways. And this hillside was so hilly, I knew it was going to be a difficult task to do that. So what we had to do was first think about, how do we complete those walkways? Well, we knew to get a gentle slope, we were going to have to bring in a tremendous amount of fill dirt.
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of elevation change here. You know, we're down in the valley, but if we look up to the top of this garden, I don't know how big the change is, but it's got to be 60, 70 feet of elevation change just from where we are here.
150 feet.
Wow.
150 feet. Now that's to the manor house.
Right.
So from where we're standing now to the crest, that's 150 feet of change all the way up to the house. But this garden probably has at least what you're saying, half of that. So you're right, it's about 70, 75 feet of change in elevation in this one area.
Right, and so thousands and thousands and thousands of cubic yards of soil go into this. And that is an important part of the planning of a garden and being able to look at a space and think in advance about those kind of things that are very difficult to change after the fact. If you don't get your paths correct, and if it's an uncomfortable garden for people to navigate, it's very, very hard to go back later and change that. And that's why the planning and having a budget is a huge part of the bones of a garden that ultimately allow it to be something that will survive for generations and be something the public will enjoy, well after all of us are gone.
What you just said is so true, and of course, if it's a very small garden, if it's a medium-sized garden or a very large garden like this, over 10 acres, you do the same thing.
So I'm just now embarking on a new space. It's gonna be a very, very small garden, but I moved recently and there's nothing back there except for one water oak. That's it. And so I'm thinking about all of the things that you're talking about. How is the space going to be used? How is it going to be navigated? And getting the structural parts of it correct up front. So even though this is a small 30-foot by 30-foot space that I'm tackling, all of those principles translate to a garden of any size.
You're exactly right. So just follow it for a small garden, a medium-sized garden, or a very large garden. It doesn't make any difference.
In the progression of developing this new space, we've graded out our pathways, so we know the way that the space is going to be used. What do you do next, Jim?
I know that the first thing I want to do is put irrigation in. Most of your main irrigation lines, the main lines, are going to follow the walkways. So if you've put that in, when you start planting, you're able to immediately start watering your plants.
One of the mistakes that I've made many, many times as a gardener is not giving enough thought to exactly what plants are going to go where. We're in love with thousands and thousands of different plants, and we have ideas as to which, colors or textures might look good together. How do you go about the process of thinking about, okay, for this section of this garden, I want these specific plants to go there?
The first thing I do on all of my designs is after I have the walkways in place and I'm thinking about plant selection, I want to first think about the sun requirements.
Right.
If you're dealing with full sun, you need 6 hours or more per day. If you're dealing with part sun, you need 4 to 6 hours. If you're dealing with part shade, you want to have 4 to 6 hours, but it needs to be more morning sun, not the hot afternoon sun. So I look at the site and decide what plants will go in each of those areas, but it all depends on the sunshade requirements. I also look and think about the plant hardiness, because I'm in zone 7 and 8. So when you're in zone 7 or 8, you got to think about what plants are going to grow in that zone. Too many people put plants in that will freeze out and you lose all your plant material. So you do have to think about your plant hardiness and the zone that you're in.
Of course, for you as a gardener, Jim, you're drawing on decades of experience when it comes to the individual plants that you select. What's some advice that you would have for our viewers in thinking about, let's say they want to put in a conifer collection garden? What type of resources do you draw on to make those selections?
I've been in the business for 50 years, so I love conifers. I know conifers, but for this particular area, being at zone 7, I wanted to go to a person I knew had planted a lot of conifers and knew conifers. Tom Cox is a conifer expert. He's a dendrologist. And I knew I wanted to call him and talk to him about what would grow in this area. I would recommend that everyone's first to go to the websites, study the websites. If you know somebody that's more of a professional, talk to those people, get them to help you with your plant selection. If you don't select the right plants for your zone, you're in trouble right away. Right. You're going to plant plants and you're going to lose them. You've invested money, and it's a total loss.
Absolutely. Well, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's the value of these amazing public gardens like Gibbs Garden. I'm in zone 8 as well. And so for me as a gardener, if I'm unsure about what is going to perform in my garden, places like this are incredibly informative and educational. And it also helps us to avoid a lot of the mistakes that could be made in the garden, as I'm able to come over here, take notes, see what's thriving and maybe what's not, and learn from that and implement that in my own space.
Well, my purpose here was to, and my goal was to actually have design and install plant collections that would educate and inspire future generations. So it's like you said, Gibbs Gardens has 336 acres. We have 16 garden venues now, and we're adding 5 more for 21. So you can come and look at all the plants, take notes, see how they grow, and study them better.
Jim, of course, I'm eager to have us talk about the plant collections here, but first I want us to dive into what your inspiration was and your vision was, just in kind of a 30,000 foot view of what you really wanted this space to be. At the point at which you've got, your trails are in, your irrigation's in, you've thought about sunshade requirements, but what was your vision for this space?
Well, my vision, of course, for Gibbs Gardens is to feature plant collections. And we already have 16 garden venues. Each of those garden venues featured different plant collections. So I wanted to feature some that I did not have.
Right.
So I had always wanted to have a plant collection of conifers, but I wanted to be all dwarf conifers. The thought was, if I could create on these 3-4 levels which would look like a natural hillside of conifers, the conifer area would occupy one space. Those are dwarf conifers, remember, not the big tall conifers that take up lots of space. So the dwarf conifers. Then I wanted to have a collection of Encore azaleas because they're evergreen. The Encore azalea will bloom more than one time a year. We have Encores here that'll bloom some 2 and some 3 times a year. And of course, I could use the Encore because it also grows in full sun, which most people don't realize. The other thing I wanted to do was to have a collection of native azaleas. And with the native azaleas, they're deciduous, and I wanted them to be in the background of the Encore azaleas. So the native azaleas, I have 1,800 of those with over 100 varieties, probably the largest in the Southeast. But with the Encore azaleas, we have all 33 varieties, and we have over 1,200 Encore azaleas following the walkways. So that gives me 3 collections. And then I wanted to add a collection of rare and unusual dwarf Japanese maples. They work well with the conifers. So I put those in with the conifers, and I also wanted a dwarf ginkgo collection, and they work well with conifers because they are part of the conifer family. And then what I wanted to do was to add some color for spring, summer, and fall, was to have the dwarf series, the drift series of roses, which are all dwarf, low maintenance. And I wanted to have, of course, the knockout roses, a series of knockout roses, because they, of course, give you color during the spring, summer, and fall.
I love the use of dwarf plants. I use them all the time in my gardening, and one of the most obvious practical reasons to use dwarf plants is that we can have a lot more plants in a given space, and we don't have to worry so much about this deodar cedar that at some point in time is going to be 40 feet wide and 70 feet tall, which limits the way that we can use a space. And also for a visitor to the garden, it's wonderful to be able to walk through these small gardens and actually see hundreds of different plants. So it's a really, really smart way of putting that together. And I know you worked with Brent Marcus on this, who we've had on the show, is a wonderful conifer expert. So he was instrumental, at least in some ways, in selecting the plants that we used here, right?
The dwarf Japanese maples all came from Brent, which is in Oregon, near the Portland area. The conifers came from different people, but Tom Cox, he's the authority on conifers for our area. Tom actually, I asked him to come up with a selection of all the conifers that would live in zone 7 and 8. And once I got the selection, I then put the plants together depending on their form, their texture, and their colors. So I grouped them that way. But again, when you mentioned earlier the conifers and dwarf plants, remember, they're the lowest maintenance of all the plants. Maintenance can be very expensive, so the homeowner needs to think about the cost. You don't have to prune them. You prune some, but very, very little pruning. And they always stay within the space if you look at the tag and select, because it'll tell you on the tag exactly what spacing to put them, how large they get in 10 years. You know everything when you start. So the maintenance is a big consideration.
So Jim, let's talk a little bit about the Encore azalea collection that you have here.
Well, Buddy Lee is the person that came up with, he worked on the breeding program for the Encore azaleas. And I asked Buddy to come up from Louisiana, that's where he lives. And we talked about the Encore azaleas and the Encores that I wanted to feature all of his varieties. Of course, he was thrilled. And he gave me all kinds of tips on Encore azaleas. And we talked for probably a half a day or 3/4 of a day on just Encore azaleas. But he's an interesting person and very, very knowledgeable. He loves plants and plant collections, and he has put his life and just his heart in to the Encore azalea collection. It's a wonderful collection. The colors are magnificent. He has the dwarf ones, the intermediate varieties, and you can select whatever you want. And I color coordinated all of my azaleas, Encore azaleas, based on my talks with Buddy and which ones would perform best in our zone. And we worked together, so it was a great experience for me.
One huge advantage to this collection is, Jim, it wouldn't matter if I was here in January or June or September. This garden is always going to be beautiful, and it's always more or less going to look the same.
Well, it's definitely a 4-season garden, and you have all of these beautiful colors, and even in the wintertime when everything else is bleak and all the leaves have dropped off of the trees, and you come into the conifer garden, your spirits are lifted, you feel good. The morning sun with all of these colors of blue-grays and greens and chartreuses, they just make you feel good.
Well, that's one of the amazing things about gardens. It's why we love visiting gardens. It's why we love gardening ourselves, is because of what it does for our hearts. And it does bring happiness to people. Jim, what an amazing job you've done here, and it's always a pleasure to spend time with you, and thank you so much for sharing the time.
Thank you for coming. I enjoyed it.
Each week we travel the country north to south, east to west, visiting some of the most exciting gardens, as well as talking to industry horticulturalists about design principles, new plants, and also how you can be most successful with your home gardens. We also love answering your gardening questions, so visit us on the web at GardenSMART.com.
These moments of beauty and relaxation are brought to you by Proven Winners Flowering Shrubs, where every plant is performance tested, leaving you free to just enjoy. Find our award-winning shrubs at your local garden center.
Now more than ever, our homes are our havens, where we learn, love, and live. Let garden projects, inspired or simple, bring beauty and comfort to you. Wherever you choose to plant good, we're with you.
DRAM has been providing gardeners with professional equipment for over 75 years. DRAM products feature 9 water patterns and are designed to nurture your plants with a shower of rain. DRAM for lawn and garden, available at garden centers near you.
You have to rely on your gear. The way it feels, the way it does exactly what you need it to do. The F-Pace, how Jaguar makes it SUV.
The process of embarking on a new garden expansion is so exciting to watch. We followed the development of the Inspiration Garden for the past 2 years and are excited to finally see it all coming to fruition. If you have questions about anything you've seen today, visit us on the web at GardenSMART.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram. And remember, even if you're a master gardener, there's always more to learn. So join us next week for more great gardening tips and ideas as we garden smart.